The room was designed to silence people before they even spoke. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The power in the space existed in stillness, the kind that pressed against the chest and made breathing feel like permission rather than instinct. The walls were dark, not just in color but in purpose, absorbing everything. Sound, movement, hesitation. Nothing escaped unnoticed. Nothing existed without consequence. Arya Monroe stood in the center of it, completely still. To anyone watching, she looked exactly like what they expected her to be. A woman placed in situations she could not control, surrounded by men who had already decided her fate. Her posture was composed, her expression unreadable, her silence mistaken for submission. But silence, in her case, was never weakness. It was calculation. The air carried tension thick enough to feel physical. Every man in the room held a position, a role, a reason for being there. Some watched with interest, others with indifference, but none of them questioned what was about to happen. Because in this world, decisions were not discussed, they were enforced. And Arya had already been decided. The man standing across from her spoke without urgency, as if the outcome had long been settled. She didn't need to hear the words again. She already understood them. Say yes or your mother dies. There had been no theatrics, no raised voices, no visible threats. Just a simple statement, delivered with the kind of confidence that came from knowing resistance was meaningless. For most people, that moment would have shattered something. Fear would have surfaced. Panic would have followed. Desperation would have made itself visible in trembling hands, uneven breath, broken composure. But Arya Monroe didn't break. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she had learned, long before this moment, that fear was most dangerous when it could be seen. So she didn't show it. Instead, she listened, not to the words, but to everything around them. The shift of weight from one man to another. The subtle tightening of posture from those who expected resistance. The absence of surprise from those who already knew her answer. And then there was him. Roman Vex stood slightly apart from the rest, not because he needed distance, but because the room naturally formed around him. Power didn't follow him. It settled in place wherever he chose to stand. He hadn't spoken. He didn't need to. His presence alone defined the outcome. Cold, controlled, unreadable, his gaze rested on Arya, not casually, not with curiosity, but with focus. The kind of focus that didn't look a person, but through them, as if he wasn't observing what she was showing, but searching for what she was hiding. And that was when she understood something important. This wasn't just about the deal. It wasn't just about her mother. This moment, this entire situation, had been built with intention. Around her, a quiet realization settled into her mind, steady and sharp. This wasn't a choice. It was a structure, and she had been placed at its center. For a brief second, something shifted behind her calm expression. Not fear, not panic, but awareness. A deeper understanding of the situation than anyone in that room expected her to have. Because if this was planned, then she wasn't just a participant. She was a target. The silence stretched, waiting for her to react, waiting for her to break, waiting for her to confirm everything they believed about her. But Arya didn't move the way they expected. She didn't look at the man who had delivered the threat. She didn't look at the others who were watching her like an outcome already decided. She looked at Roman, directly, not with defiance, not with fear, but with something far more dangerous. Recognition. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was enough, because in that brief moment, something passed between them. Not spoken, not acknowledged, but understood. He didn't look surprised. That was the first confirmation. A man like Roman Vex didn't waste attention. He didn't study things that didn't matter. And he certainly didn't stand silent in moments where control needed to be asserted. Unless control wasn't the objective. Unless observation was. Arya felt it then. Clearly, he wasn't waiting for her answer. He was watching how she reached it. And that meant something far more dangerous than the threat itself. Because it meant the decision had already been made. Not by her, but about her. A quiet shift in her breathing followed. Not enough to notice, but enough to anchor her focus. If this was a test, then the answer mattered less than the way she gave it. And that was something she could control. Slowly, deliberately, She let the silence extend just long enough to feel intentional, not hesitation. Timing. The room adjusted to it without realizing. Attention sharpened. Expectations tightened. Even those who had already dismissed her began to look again because something didn't align. She wasn't reacting. She was choosing. And choice, even the absence of freedom, changed everything. When she finally spoke, it wasn't rushed. It wasn't forced. It was steady, controlled, final. She said yes. The words settled into the room without resistance. No relief followed it. No visible reaction. Just a quiet acceptance. As if everything had moved exactly as intended. Because it had. To them, it was confirmation. To her, it was alignment. The deal was done. The structure held. The outcome remained intact. But something subtle had shifted beneath it. Something no one in the room could fully define, except one person. Roman's gaze didn't move. If anything, it sharpened. Not because she had agreed, but because of how easily she had. There was no relief in her expression, no visible grief, no trace of the desperation that should have followed a decision like that. Instead, there was stillness, the same controlled stillness she had walked in with. And that was wrong, not for them, but for him, because people like her didn't exist without reason, and calm like that didn't come without cost. For the first time, his attention shifted, not outward, not toward the deal, but inward toward a question that hadn't existed before. Who was she? Not the name, not the role, but the truth beneath it. Arya felt it, the weight of his focus, the shift in his perception, and she understood something in return. He wasn't satisfied, which meant this wasn't over, not even close. As movement finally returned to the room, documents being finalized, decisions being sealed, outcomes becoming reality, Arya remained exactly where she was, unmoved, unshaken, unbroken, because breaking had never been part of the equation, not for her. And as she stood there, surrounded by power that believed it had just secured control, a single thought settled quietly into place. Not fear, not regret, but clarity. This wasn't the moment she lost control. This was the moment she stepped into it. And as she allowed herself one final glance toward Roman Vex, she saw it clearly in his eyes. Not certainty, not dominance, but something far more dangerous. Interest. A slow, deliberate realization formed in her mind. He wasn't testing her loyalty. He wasn't securing obedience. He wasn't even confirming control. He was waiting to see what she would reveal. And that meant one thing. As she turned away, her expression unchanged, her thoughts precise and untouched by the chaos around her, the truth settled into place with quiet certainty. He didn't want her to obey. He wanted to understand her. And that made him far more dangerous than the threat that had forced her into this room, because understanding led to control. And control, in his world, meant possession. But what he didn't realize yet was that she had never walked into the situation unprepared. And as the deal finalized behind her, sealing her fate in the eyes of everyone else, one realization echoed louder than anything that had been said aloud. She hadn't just been forced into this decision. She had been placed into it. And as that truth settled deeper, one final thought sharpened with quiet intensity. This wasn't about loyalty. This wasn't about survival. This was about something far more calculated. Because as she said yes, she understood something he hadn't revealed. He wasn't testing her loyalty. He was testing what she was hiding. The moment the decision was made, everything around Arya Monroe changed, just not in the way anyone expected. The room that had once held tension now carried something quieter, more controlled. The deal had been accepted. The outcome had been sealed. To everyone else, it was simple, a life exchange for power, a woman place where she could be managed, shaped, controlled. But Arya understood something they didn't. The danger hadn't ended. It had just shifted. Because death had never been her greatest fear. Exposure was. That truth sat beneath her calm exterior like a hidden fracture, unseen, but capable of breaking everything if pressured the wrong way. And as she was led away from the room that had defined her fate, her mind did not linger on what she had lost. It focused on what she could not afford to reveal. Her identity was not a single secret. It was a network of truths layered so carefully that even one piece slipping out could unravel everything. To the world, she was Arya Monroe, quiet, composed, easily underestimated. But that version of her was constructed, refined, controlled. Beneath it existed something far more dangerous. A past written in alliances no longer acknowledged, in bloodlines that had been erased from public memory, but still existed in the shadows of power, in systems that operated beyond law, beyond loyalty, beyond survival, and most importantly, in knowledge. Because Arya Monroe didn't just understand the world she had been forced into. She had been trained to navigate it. Long before this moment, long before the threat against her mother, long before Roman Vex had ever looked at her with calculated interest, she had learned how to survive in environments where trust was weakness and hesitation was fatal. Her silence had not been born from fear. It had been built through discipline, carefully shaped into something that protected her more effectively than any weapon ever could. And now, in a place where every movement was observed, every reaction analyzed, every weakness exploited, her silence became her strongest defense. The environment she was taken into reflected the man who controlled it. Roman Vex did not build chaos. He built systems. Everything had structure. Everything had purpose. Every person within his reach existed within a hierarchy that was clear, controlled, and absolute. There were no accidents in his world, only placements. And Arya knew exactly where she had been placed. Not at the top, not at the bottom, but somewhere far more strategic. A position that allowed observation, but also demanded it. She moved through it without resistance, not because she accepted it, but because she understood it. Her behavior remained consistent with what they expected. Quiet, obedient, unremarkable. She followed instructions without hesitation, responded when necessary, and remained invisible when she could. To most, it confirmed what they already believed, that she was exactly what she appeared to be. But that illusion required precision. Every movement had to be calculated, every reaction measured, because the moment she revealed too much awareness, too much control, too much understanding, everything would change. And she couldn't afford that. Not yet, because her presence there was not random. It was not accidental. And it was definitely not powerless. There had been a reason she was chosen. A reason the threat had been directed at her. A reason the situation had unfolded with such specific intent. And until she fully understood that reason, revealing herself was not an option. Trust in her world did not exist. Not in people, not in systems, not in outcomes. Trust created vulnerability, and vulnerability created exposure. So she trusted nothing, not the walls around her, not the silence that followed her movements, and certainly not the man who had watched her too closely from the very beginning. Roman Vex did not behave like the others. That was the first inconsistency. He did not assert control loudly. He did not enforce authority through intimidation alone. He observed, and observation was far more dangerous, because it meant he was not reacting. He was learning. At first, his attention had been subtle, barely noticeable, a shift in focus, a pause that lasted a second longer than necessary. But over time, it became clearer, more intentional. He was watching her, not constantly, but precisely, as if each moment of attention had been chosen for a reason. And that was when Arya realized something that unsettled even her controlled perception. He wasn't trying to break her. He was trying to understand her. That difference changed everything. Because breaking someone required force. Understanding someone required patience. And patience meant time. Time meant observation. And observation meant exposure, which made him more dangerous than anyone else in that environment. Because while others saw her as something temporary, he saw her as something unfinished, something undefined, something worth studying. And that meant her margin for error was disappearing. The duality she had built, the separation between what she showed and what she was, had to remain intact. Her outer self remained unchanged, calm, controlled, compliant. But internally, everything was active. Every detail she noticed was stored. Every pattern she observed was analyzed. Every shift in behavior around her was recorded. She wasn't surviving. She was preparing. For what, she didn't fully know yet. But she understood one thing clearly. Whatever game she had been pulled into, she was not the only one playing it. And Roman Vex was not a man who allowed unknown variables to exist in his world, which meant eventually he would push, not directly, but strategically. And when that happened, the smallest mistake could expose everything. Her past, her purpose, her connection to forces far more dangerous than anyone in that empire realized. And if that happened, it wouldn't just put her at risk. It would destroy everything she had been trying to protect. Her mother, her mission, her identity. All of it would collapse in a moment. And that was something she could not allow. So she adapted, more carefully than before, more precisely than before. Her silence became deeper, more intentional, not empty, but controlled, because silence, when used correctly, did more than hide truth. It redirected attention. It created assumptions, and assumptions were easier to control than reality. But even that strategy had limits, because Roman was no longer making assumptions. He was questioning them. The shift was subtle, but undeniable. He no longer observed her as part of the system. He observed her as an exception to it. And exceptions demanded answers. Arya felt in the way the environment responded to her. Small changes, barely visible, but present. More eyes where there had been fewer. More pauses where there had been none. More awareness surrounding her presence. Not enough to confirm suspicion, but enough to signal interest. And interest in his world always led to investigation, which meant time was no longer neutral. It was a countdown, a quiet, invisible pressure building beneath every moment she remained undiscovered. Because the longer she stayed hidden, the more dangerous the reveal would be, and the more valuable she would become, not as a person, but as a threat. And Roman Vex did not tolerate threats, unless they interested him. That thought settled into her mind with a clarity that couldn't be ignored. He wasn't just watching her anymore. He was waiting for something to confirm what he already suspected. Waiting for a moment where her control slipped, even slightly, because that was all it would take. Not a confession, not a mistake, just a shift, something small, something subtle, something real, and then everything would change. Arya remained still, controlled, unshaken, but for the first time since entering his world, she recognized something that hadn't existed before. Not fear, but risk, real risk. Because this was no longer just about survival. It was about precision. And even the smallest miscalculation could expose everything she had spent years protecting. As she moved through the controlled silence of his world, her expression unchanged, her presence carefully measured, one realization echoed beneath every thought, every decision, every controlled breath. She was not hiding from him. She was hiding from what would happen if he understood her. And as that truth settled deeper into her awareness, sharpening her focus, refining her control, preparing her for what was coming next, she felt it again. His attention, not constant, not obvious, but deliberate, focused, unrelenting. And that was when the final realization formed, quiet but undeniable. The more he watched her, the more he was beginning to understand. Her silence was not fear, it was control. Control, in Roman Vex world, was not something that needed to be announced. It was understood. It lived in silence, in structure, in the absence of chaos. Nothing in his empire was accidental. Every movement had a purpose. Every person had a place. Every outcome had already been calculated long before it happened. And that was what made him dangerous. Because control, for Roman Vex, was not force. It was design. The transition into his world had been seamless for Arya Monroe, but only on the surface. To others, she had simply been absorbed into a system, another variable place where it needed to be, another life adjusted to fit his structure. But Arya understood something deeper. She hadn't been placed randomly. She had been positioned, and positions in a world like his always came with intention. Roman's empire was not built on emotion, loyalty, or even fear alone. It was built on predictability. People behaved in ways he could measure. Systems operated in ways he could control. Even chaos, when it appeared, was quickly absorbed, reshaped, and contained. Nothing stayed undefined for long. Except her. That was the flaw. Or perhaps the disruption. Arya moved through his world carefully, observing without appearing to observe. Her steps were measured, her expressions controlled, her presence minimal enough to avoid attention, but not so minimal that it seemed intentional. She blended in. But internally, she was mapping everything. Patterns, routines, power flows, weak points. She noticed how information traveled, who spoke, who listened, who decided. She watched how authority shifted depending on context, how certain individuals carried influence without ever raising their voices. And most importantly, she watched Roman, not directly, never directly, but through the way the world responded to him. Because men like Roman Vex didn't reveal themselves easily. They revealed themselves through impact. The way conversations stopped when he entered a room. The way decisions accelerated or disappeared depending on his presence. The way even the most powerful men adjusted their tone without realizing it. He didn't demand control. He defined it. And yet, despite everything being structured, predictable, controlled, there was one thing in his world that didn't behave the way it should. Her. At first, the difference was subtle, almost invisible. Arya followed instructions. She did not challenge authority. She remained composed, quiet, unremarkable. But she didn't react the way others did. She didn't anticipate approval. She didn't seek validation. She didn't show fear, not even the control version most people use to survive. Instead, she existed within his system without being shaped by it, and that made her unpredictable. Roman noticed. Of course he did. A man who controlled everything could not ignore something that refused to be defined. But he didn't confront it. He didn't question her. He didn't force answers. He observed. That was his method, because pressure revealed weakness, but time revealed truth. So he gave her neither fully. Instead, he tested her, indirectly. Subtly, situations began to change around her, not enough to be obvious, but enough to measure reaction. Instructions shifted slightly. Expectations adjusted without explanation. Variables were introduced into her environment to see how she would respond. And Arya noticed. Not the tests themselves, but the intent behind them, which meant the game had already begun. And she hadn't been asked if she wanted to play. That realization didn't create panic. It created clarity. Because if he was studying her, then she could study him. The difference was, he believed he had control over the environment. She knew control could exist within it. So she adapted, more precisely than before. She didn't resist the tests. She didn't expose awareness. She responded exactly as expected, but with subtle adjustments. Enough to gather information, enough to understand patterns, enough to remain one step outside of full predictability. It was a dangerous balance, because too much awareness would expose her, and too little would make her irrelevant. So she stayed in between, not free, not controlled, something undefined. And that undefined space, that was where power began to shift, slowly. Almost imperceptibly. Roman's attention, once occasional, became more focused, not constant, but deliberate. He chose when to observe her, and more importantly, he chose not to look away. It wasn't interest, not yet. It was analysis, but analysis required engagement, and engagement created connection, even if it wasn't acknowledged. That was the flaw in control. The more you studied something, the more it began to influence you. And Roman Vex was beginning to be influenced, not emotionally, not consciously, but strategically, because for the first time in his system, there was something he couldn't define. And undefined variables disrupted structure. Arya understood that, which was why she never gave him a clear answer, not in behavior, not in reaction, not even in silence, because her silence was not empty. It was layered. Every pause carried intention. Every still moment carried awareness, and every control reaction carried meaning he couldn't fully decode, which forced him to look deeper. And the deeper he looked, the more control began to slip, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough to matter, because control wasn't about dominance. It was about certainty, and certainty required understanding, which meant the less he understood her, the less certain his control became. That shift was small, but it was real, and it was growing. Others didn't see it. They couldn't. To them, everything remained the same. Roman was still in control. His empire still functioned without disruption. His authority remained unquestioned. But subtle changes existed beneath the surface, and those who paid close attention began to notice. Not her, not directly, but him, the way his focus shifted in certain moments, the way his silence carried more weight when she was present, the way his decisions sometimes paused, just briefly, as if calculating something beyond the immediate situation. It wasn't enough to raise suspicion, but it was enough to create questions. And in a world built on control, questions were dangerous. Arya felt it too. Not the questions themselves, but the shift in perception. The space she occupied was changing. Not physically, but strategically. She was no longer just part of the system. She was becoming a point of attention within it. And attention, from someone like Roman Vex, was never neutral. It was either control or interest, and sometimes it was both, which made her position more dangerous than ever, because the closer he came to understanding her, the closer he came to uncovering everything she had been hiding. And that was when it happened. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough for the right person to see. Someone close to Roman, someone who understood his patterns, someone who noticed what others ignored. They saw it, they recognized it, and they couldn't explain it. Roman Vex was watching her more than necessary, and no one understood why. Truth, in Roman Vex's world, was not something that revealed itself easily. It was buried, hidden beneath layers of control, silence, and calculated deception. In a system built on precision, nothing important surfaced by accident, and yet the most dangerous truths never arrived loudly. They slipped through, quietly, unnoticed at first, until it was too late to hide them again. The shift began so subtly that no one marked the exact moment it happened. There was no dramatic mistake, no visible crack in Arya Monroe's composure, no obvious betrayal of the carefully constructed silence she had maintained since entering Roman's world. But something changed, a detail, small enough to be dismissed, precise enough to matter. It happened during a controlled exchange, one of the many structured interactions within Roman's network, where information moved carefully, deliberately, never without purpose. Arya was present as expected, silent, observant, exactly as she had always been. But this time, she reacted, not visibly, not in a way most would notice, but in a way that mattered, a fraction too early, a pause too calculated, a response that aligned too perfectly with information she should not have fully understood. To everyone else, it meant nothing. To Roman, it meant everything. Because control was not about watching what people did. It was about noticing what they almost did. And Arya, for the first time, had revealed something unintended, not her secret, but the existence of one. That was enough. The environment didn't change immediately. Roman didn't confront her. He didn't shift his behavior in any obvious way, because men like him didn't react to information. They absorbed it, and then they waited. So he watched, closer than before, not for confirmation, but for pattern, because a single mistake could be dismissed. A pattern could not. Arya felt it, not as pressure, but as awareness. The air around her had not changed, but the attention within it had. It had sharpened, focused, and unlike before, it no longer felt like observation. It felt like anticipation. That realization settled quietly within her, but it did not disrupt her composure. If anything, it refined it, because Arya understood something most people in that world did not. Exposure did not happen all at once. It happened in fragments, in details, in moments where perception shifted just enough to change how everything was seen. And she had just created one of those moments. The mistake had been small, but the consequences would not be, because now others were beginning to notice, not her fully, not yet, but the idea of her. It started within the edges of Roman's network, those who paid attention not to what was said, but to what was implied. They began connecting small inconsistencies, her presence, her behavior, her reactions, None of it aligned perfectly with the role she had been placed into. At first, it was dismissed as difference. Then, it became suspicion. Because in a world built on predictability, anything that didn't fit became a question. And questions, in that world, always led to answers, whether they were wanted or not. Arya recognized the shift immediately. The glances that lasted slightly longer. The pauses in conversation when she entered a space. The subtle recalculations in how people positioned themselves around her. It wasn't fear. Not yet, but it was awareness. And awareness was the first step toward exposure. Still, she did not react. She did not adjust in a way that could be seen. Because reacting would confirm everything. Instead, she became more precise, more controlled, more aligned with expectation than ever before. But internally, everything accelerated. Her thoughts sharpened, her calculations deepened, because now the situation had evolved. She was no longer just maintaining a secret. She was protecting it under observation, and that required something far more dangerous than silence. It required control. The kind of control that did not come from power, but from restraint. Roman noticed that too. Of course he did, because the more pressure the environment placed on her, the more stable she became. And that was not normal. It was not expected. It was not explainable within the boundaries of the role she was supposed to be playing, which meant she was not what she appeared to be. That conclusion settled into place with quiet certainty. But even then, Roman did not act. He did not expose her. He did not confront her, because he had never been interested in simple answers. He was interested in complete understanding. And understanding required time. So instead of forcing the truth, he allowed it to unfold. And that was far more dangerous. Because a forced truth could be controlled. A revealed truth could not. Arya realized at the moment his behavior didn't change. Not outwardly. Not visibly. He continued exactly as before. Maintaining structure. Maintaining order. Maintaining control. But something beneath that control had shifted. He was no longer trying to find her. He was waiting for her to define herself. And that was the most dangerous position she could be in, because it meant he already knew enough. The tension between them changed after that. Not dramatically, not in a way others could easily identify, but in a way that altered everything. Before, it had been observation. Now, it was awareness. Before, it had been analysis. Now, it was confirmation in progress, and the space between them reflected that shift. It became heavier, sharper, more deliberate. Every interaction carried weight. Every moment of silence carried meaning. Every movement, every glance, every pause became part of something neither of them openly acknowledged, a silent understanding that something had changed, and it could not be reversed. Meanwhile, the outside pressure continued to build. Rivals, those who had always been watching Roman's world from a distance, began to notice the same inconsistencies, not in detail, but in pattern. They saw the way attention subtly shifted around her. They saw the way she existed within the system without being shaped by it. And slowly, carefully, they began asking questions. Not directly, never directly, but enough to create movement, enough to create tension, enough to make her presence matter. That was the problem. Once a secret became relevant, it became dangerous. Arya understood that better than anyone, which was why she did not attempt to disappear into the background, because it was too late for that. Instead, she adjusted her position, not by retreating, but by stabilizing. She maintained her presence exactly where it was, balanced between visibility and control, enough to avoid suspicion, enough to prevent deeper investigation. But that balance was fragile, and she knew it, because there was one factor she could not fully control. Roman, his silence, his patience, his refusal to act. It was not indifference. It was intention, and intention, when left unspoken, was far more dangerous than any direct threat, because it meant he was waiting, not for proof, but for the right moment. That realization settled into place with chilling clarity. And for the first time, not fear, but something sharper touched the edges of her control. Awareness of timing. because whatever he knew, whatever he suspected, he had not discovered it recently. He had not connected the pieces in response to her mistake. No, the truth was far more unsettling than that. He had been watching for this, waiting for this, allowing it to surface. That was when everything aligned. The small tests, the controlled environment, the subtle pressure, the way his attention had sharpened even before the mistake. It had never been about discovering her secret. It had been about confirming it. That realization changed everything, because it meant she had never been hidden, not truly, not completely. She had only been unrevealed, and now that phase was ending. The truth was no longer buried. It was surfacing, piece by piece, detail by detail, and once fully exposed, it would not just change her position. It would change the entire structure around her, because her presence had never been neutral. It had always carried consequence, and those consequences were beginning to take shape as the tension tightened, as the unspoken awareness between them deepened, as the outside world began circling closer to the truth. One final detail settled into place, quietly, but undeniably, not something new, but something that had been there all along, something Arya had missed, something she had not fully understood. Until now, Roman Vex had never once asked who she was, not directly, not indirectly, not even through implication. And in a world where information was everything, that absence was not oversight, it was certainty, which led to one unavoidable conclusion. He had never needed to discover her secret, because he had already known it, and he had been waiting, not to uncover it, but to see when she would reveal it herself. The moment a person stopped pretending to be weak, the balance of power never returned to what it once was. In Roman Vex's world, weakness was not always real. It was often performed, controlled, used as a shield, a tool, a strategy. But what mattered was not the presence of weakness. It was the moment it disappeared, because the absence of weakness did not always signal strength. Sometimes it signaled awareness, and awareness changed everything. Arya Monroe reached that point without announcement. There was no dramatic shift, no visible declaration, no moment that others could point to and say something had changed. But those who paid attention, those who understood behavior beneath surface, would have noticed it immediately. Her silence did not change. Her movements did not become louder or more aggressive. Her presence did not expand in a way that demanded attention. Instead, something quieter occurred, something far more dangerous. She stopped performing vulnerability, not completely, not in a way that would disrupt the system around her, but enough that it altered how she existed within it. Before, she had been someone who blended into expectations. Now, she moved slightly outside of them, not enough to be detected easily, but enough to no longer be defined by them. It was subtle, almost invisible, but in a controlled environment like Roman Vex, subtle shifts were the most dangerous kind, because they were intentional. And intentional meant calculated, which meant she was no longer just reacting to the system. She was engaging with it. That realization did not arrive all at once for Roman. It built gradually, layer by layer, through observation, through contradiction, through moments that didn't align with expectation. At first, he dismissed them, small inconsistencies, minor deviations, adjustments that could be explained away if needed. But Roman Vex did not rely on explanations. He relied on patterns. And patterns, once disrupted, always revealed something underneath. So he watched, more closely than before, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. Because curiosity, in his world, came before everything else. Curiosity led to attention. Attention led to analysis. And analysis led to understanding. But something was different this time, because the more he observed her, the less predictable she became. Not in action, but in intention. She was no longer simply responding to her environment. She was shaping how she moved within it. Subtly, quietly, without drawing attention. A shift in timing. A slight adjustment in behavior. A moment where she chose not to react, and instead allowed something else to unfold. Each of these changes, individually, meant nothing, but together They began to form a pattern, and Roman noticed. Of course he did. At first, it sparked curiosity, not concern. Curiosity was neutral. It simply meant something did not fit. But curiosity in a man like Roman Vex never stayed neutral for long. It evolved. And in this case, it evolved into irritation. Because Arya Monroe was not behaving like something that needed to be controlled. She was behaving like something that understood control. And that difference, that subtle, almost imperceptible difference, shifted the nature of their interaction. She was no longer a variable inside his system. She was becoming something else, something that interacted with the system itself. Not directly, never directly, but effectively. And that was what made it dangerous. Because systems could be controlled, variables could be managed, but influence required adaptation. And Roman Vex was not used to adapting. He was used to dictating, which meant, for the first time in a long time, something was happening that he did not fully control. And that realization changed his focus, not outwardly, never outwardly, but internally, completely. The shift began with attention. Where before his focus on Arya had been calculated and limited, it now expanded, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to. And in Roman's world, that distinction mattered, because need was predictable, want was not. So he watched her more closely, not constantly, but deliberately. Every movement, every pause, every subtle decision. He studied the way she existed within pressure, the way she responded to silence, the way she navigated space without revealing intention. And with each observation, the irritation grew, not because she failed to conform, but because she didn't need to. She wasn't resisting his control. She was moving within it, using it, understanding it. And that was something he had not anticipated. For someone like Roman, control was absolute, or it was nothing. But Arya existed in a space that didn't fit that definition. She was neither controlled nor free. She was aware, and awareness was dangerous, because awareness allowed prediction, and prediction allowed influence. At first, Roman did not acknowledge this shift. He adapted instead. Quietly, subtly, without announcing the change. New variables were introduced into her environment, not as tests, but as observations. Situations designed to measure response without forcing it. And Arya responded, not with resistance, but with precision. She adjusted, matched, balanced, and sometimes redirected. Not enough to be noticed by others, but enough to register within the system itself. And Roman felt it, every time, not as disruption, but as challenge, which changed the nature of his curiosity. Curiosity, in its purest form, seeks understanding, but when challenged, it seeks dominance. And that was where the dynamic began to shift. Not loudly, not visibly, but undeniably. They were no longer operating in a simple structure of control and submission. They were engaging in something far more complex. Something neither had explicitly acknowledged, but both understood. A game, not spoken, not defined, but active. And once it began, it could not be ignored. Arya recognized it early. Not the moment it started, but the moment it became real. The moment Roman stopped observing passively and began engaging deliberately. That was when she adjusted again. Not defensively, not reactively, but strategically. Because now, the environment was no longer static. It was interactive, and that required precision. She stopped allowing herself to appear predictable, even in small ways. Her responses became layered. Her silences became intentional. Her presence, though still controlled, carried subtle variations that prevented complete mapping, because she understood something critical. If he could predict her completely, she would lose. Not immediately, but eventually. So she remained just beyond his reach, close enough to be studied, but not enough to be defined. And that frustrated him more than anything else had before. Because for a man like Roman Vex, not being able to define something was not just an inconvenience. It was a disruption, a challenge. And challenges in his world did not remain unresolved for long. But this one was different because it was not external. It was internal. It was not something that could be removed. It was something that had to be understood. And understanding her required something Roman did not often engage in. Time. As the days progressed, the dynamic between them continued to evolve, not outwardly, not in ways that others could easily describe, but within the structure itself. The balance was shifting, slowly, deliberately, each of them influencing the system in their own way, each of them adjusting to the other without acknowledging it, and neither willing to concede control. But what neither of them said, what neither of them admitted, was that this was no longer about control alone. It had become something more complex, something far more dangerous. Engagement. And engagement meant connection, even if neither of them intended it, even if neither of them accepted it. Because once two forces begin interacting at this level, something always changes. And that change was already in motion. Roman felt it first, not as a realization, but as a shift in understanding. Because for the first time, something inside his world did not behave as expected. Arya was not reacting to his world. She was learning it, studying it, understanding how it functioned, and more importantly, understanding how to move within it without being controlled by it. That realization settled quietly, but completely, and once it did, Roman Vex understood something he had never encountered before. This was no longer his system alone. It was shared, and she was no longer just a variable within it. She was becoming something far more dangerous, something that could influence the system itself. For the first time, he was not controlling her, and that was when he realized she wasn't reacting to his world. She was learning how to control it. Control was something Roman Vex had never questioned. It was the foundation of his world, the reason his empire stood unchallenged, the reason men feared him without needing to understand him, the reason every outcome in his life followed a path he had already anticipated. Control was not just a method, it was identity. But what Roman had always believed about control was beginning to fracture, not loudly, not in a way that could be measured or immediately proven, but in the subtle spaces between certainty and doubt, between observation and realization. Because for the first time, something within his world was not aligning with his expectations. And that something was Arya Monroe. It began as curiosity. At first, it was barely noticeable. A slight increase in attention. A moment of pause where there used to be none. A second glance that lingered just a fraction longer than necessary. Roman told himself it was analytical, logical, a necessary adjustment to understand an anomaly within his system. Because Arya did not behave like others. She did not react the way people were supposed to react under pressure. She did not display fear in the expected form. She did not seek validation. She did not resist in obvious ways. Instead, she adapted, and adaptation in his world was always worth studying. But curiosity is rarely as controlled as it appears. What begins as observation slowly becomes focus, and focus becomes fixation. Roman did not realize the shift immediately. He only noticed that his attention kept returning to her, not because he forced it, but because it naturally drifted back. Every conversation, every decision, every movement within his environment, somehow it all circled back to Arya. And that was the first fracture. Because Roman Vex did not center his world around anything. Not people, not emotion, not unpredictability. But now, something had shifted. He found himself adjusting decisions with her in mind. Not openly, not in a way that would expose deviation from his control, but subtly, carefully, almost invisibly. A delay in an order, a reassignment of personnel, a restructuring of a situation that, on the surface, appeared unchanged, but at its core was influenced by her presence. And that was not control. That was reaction. The realization came slowly, too slowly for someone like him. But once it settled, it could not be ignored, because control does not react. Control dictates. And Roman was beginning to react. That was the moment curiosity shifted into something deeper, something less stable, something far more dangerous. Obsession did not arrive as a sudden realization. It crept in, disguised as attention, disguised as analysis, disguised as necessity. But over time, it became undeniable. Roman began watching her more than necessary, not just in moments of importance, but in moments of stillness, in silence, in the spaces where nothing should have mattered. And yet, she did, because Arya Monroe did not exist passively within his world. She moved through it with awareness, with intention, with a quiet precision that disrupted the expectations around her. And the more he watched her, the less predictable she became, which created tension, not external, not visible, but internal, because unpredictability in his world was not simply unusual, it was unacceptable. And yet, he did nothing to correct it. Instead, he protected it, not in an obvious way, not in a way that would be questioned, but subtly, carefully, without explanation. Situations that could have exposed her, adjusted, conflicts that could have escalated, redirected, threats that approached too closely, removed or neutralized before they reached her directly, not completely, not enough to reveal intent, but enough to create distance between her and unnecessary risk. Others noticed. Of course they did. In Roman Vex's world, nothing remained unnoticed for long. The change was small, but consistent, and consistency in behavior was never accidental. Whispers began to form among those closest to his inner circle, not loud enough to challenge him, but persistent enough to raise questions. Why was she still present? Why was she being observed so closely? Why had she not been removed if she was not essential? And more importantly, why did Roman continue to watch her as if she mattered? Because in a system built on control, anything that was watched more than necessary was something that mattered more than it should. Roman heard the questions. He didn't address them, because addressing them would confirm something. And Roman Vex did not confirm anything he had not fully decided to acknowledge. But internally, the conflict had already begun. His authority, his absolute, unquestioned authority, was being challenged, not directly, not through confrontation, but through something far more subtle, through presence, through unpredictability, through the simple fact that Arya Monroe did not behave like something that could be owned, directed, or contained. And yet, she remained within his world, which created an internal contradiction. If she could not be controlled, then why was she still here? And if she was still here, then what did that mean about the way she had entered his world? Had she been forced into it? Or had she chosen to enter it? That question lingered, unspoken, unresolved, but persistent, because Roman Vex understood patterns, and he understood intent. And nothing about Arya's presence felt accidental. Not anymore. Every detail began to reassemble itself in his mind. The way she reacted, the way she observed, the way she adapted under pressure instead of breaking, the way she never resisted directly, but also never submitted. None of it aligned with someone who had been trapped, which led to an unsettling possibility. She wasn't surviving his world. She was navigating it, which required intention, which required awareness, which required control. And that shifted everything. Because if she was not under control, then she had never been beneath him in the first place. The realization didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as confirmation. Quiet, calculated, inevitable, and yet unsettling. Because for the first time in his life, Roman Vex was facing something that did not respond to him in predictable ways. Something that did not bend under pressure. Something that did not conform to expectation. Something that adjusted, learned, observed, and most importantly, remained. That alone changed the structure of his thinking. Because if she remained, then she had a reason, a purpose, a goal that extended beyond survival, which meant she was not just existing within his world, she was using it, and that was far more dangerous than any form of resistance. Arya noticed the change too, not explicitly, not as a single defining moment, but as a gradual shift in how she was perceived. The space around her tightened, not physically, but strategically. More attention, more observation, more precision in how she was monitored, but also something else, something unexpected, a subtle form of protection, not enough to be obvious, not enough to be questioned, but enough to create a boundary around her that others hesitated to cross. That was not control, not in the traditional sense. It was something else, something more complex, something that existed between ownership and awareness. And it only confirmed what Arya had begun to suspect. Roman was no longer simply observing her. He was invested, and that made him unpredictable, which meant the situation was no longer a controlled environment. It was evolving into something neither of them had fully defined. And evolution, in a world built on control, was the most dangerous force of all. The tension between them deepened, not through direct interaction, but through presence, through awareness, through the silent understanding that neither of them was behaving exactly as expected anymore. And that understanding changed everything, because now it was no longer just a question of who was in control. It was a question of whether control had ever existed the way Roman believed it did. And in the middle of that realization, a single thought began to form within him, quiet, persistent, unavoidable. He began to question, did he force her into his world, or did she walk into it on purpose? Truth, in Roman Vex's world, was not feared. It was managed, controlled, contained within boundaries that ensured it could never destabilize the structure he had built. But some truths were not meant to be managed. Some truths, once revealed, did not simply expose. They transformed, and what happened next would mark the first time Roman Vex lost something far more dangerous than control. He lost certainty. The moment arrived without warning, not as a confrontation, not as an accusation, but as a reveal that unfolded with quiet precision. Arya Monroe did not raise her voice. She did not create spectacle. She did not attempt to defend herself in the traditional sense. Instead, she revealed the truth, not all at once, but in layers, in fragments that aligned together with unmistakable clarity. And each fragment carried weight. First came the connection, not directly stated, not spoken in a way that demanded belief, but shown through details, through recognition, through patterns that could not be dismissed. Arya was not just someone who had entered Roman Vex's world. She was connected to it, specifically to its fractures, to its enemies, to the very forces that had once challenged its control from the shadows. The realization did not come as shock. It came as alignment, because suddenly everything made sense. Her presence, her awareness, her precision, her ability to adapt without breaking, her refusal to behave like someone who was trapped. She had not been surviving his world. She had been preparing within it. And now, the purpose behind that preparation was clear. She had not stumbled into his system. She had entered it with intent. And that meant everything between them had always carried a different meaning than he initially believed. Roman did not react immediately. He did not show visible disruption, because Roman Vex did not collapse under information. He adapted to it, but internally, the shift was undeniable, because now the equation had changed. Arya was no longer just a variable within his control. She was a participant in a larger system, a system that had existed long before she entered his world, a system that connected to his past, to conflicts he had resolved, to enemies he had dismantled, to threats that had once required absolute precision to eliminate. And now, that system had returned, not as a direct confrontation, but as a continuation. And Arya Monroe was part of it. That realization carried weight, not just strategically, but emotionally, because now every interaction between them was layered with meaning that had not existed before. Every moment of tension, every silence, every observation carried context, and context changed everything. Arya felt it too. The shift was not subtle anymore. It was present, defined, unavoidable. The way Roman looked at her had changed, not in hostility, not in anger, but in something far more complex, understanding. And beneath that, recognition. He saw her now, not as an object, not as a threat to be managed, but as something closer to himself than he had anticipated. And that created tension. because recognition in Roman Vec's world was not casual. It was dangerous. It meant she was no longer invisible, no longer beneath his awareness, no longer outside the structure of his decisions. She was inside it, fully, completely, and that changed the balance between them. What once was control became awareness. What once was observation became acknowledgement. And what once was power over became power between, because now neither of them held absolute control. Not anymore. The dynamic had shifted, subtly but irreversibly. Roman understood that better than anyone. He did not resist it, because resisting the truth would mean ignoring it. And Roman Vex did not ignore truths that mattered. Instead, he integrated them. But integration did not mean surrender. It meant adaptation. And what he adapted to was her. Arya did not retreat from the reveal. She did not attempt to disappear into silence, because silence in this moment would mean submission. And she was no longer in a position to submit, not after revealing the truth, not after exposing the connection that tied her to the very foundation of his world. So instead, she stood within it, fully aware, fully present, fully exposed, and yet unshaken. That, more than anything, shifted the nature of their connection, because now there was no longer a divide between observer and subject. There was only awareness between equals, and equality in a world built on imbalance was the most dangerous condition of all. The emotional tension between them deepened, not in a visible way, but in the space that existed between every interaction. Every glance carried weight. Every silence held meaning. Every moment of stillness was filled with unspoken understanding. There was betrayal, not in a simplistic sense, but in the recognition that everything they believed about each other had been incomplete. There was respect, because now they understood what the other was capable of. There was understanding, because now they saw the truth beneath the surface. And there was something else, something neither of them fully acknowledged, but both of them felt. Connection, not born from trust, but from recognition of parallel strength. Arya was no longer a mystery to be solved, and Roman was no longer a system to be decoded. They had both revealed enough, and in doing so, they had created something neither of them could ignore. A balance, not stable, not comfortable, but real. For the first time, neither of them was entirely in control, and neither of them was entirely vulnerable, which meant the relationship between them had evolved from control into something far more complex, something that carried both risk and depth, something that could not be defined by simple terms, because now they were no longer operating on opposite ends of a hierarchy. They were operating within the same space. Equal awareness mirrored awareness. Control met control, and neither was willing to yield. Roman could have ended it if he had wanted to. He could have removed her from his world the moment the truth was revealed. He could have treated her as a threat, neutralized her, destroyed the connection. But he didn't, because something about her prevented him from doing so. Not obligation, not necessity. Something deeper, something that had formed through observation, through tension, through the slow realization that she was not like anyone else he had encountered. And that realization was enough to make him pause, enough to make him reconsider, enough to make him keep her within his reach instead of pushing her away. Because in his world, distance was power, but presence was influence. And Arya Monroe had become something far more dangerous than a distant threat. She was now within his control structure, and yet not controlled. That paradox defined everything now, and neither of them stepped back from it. Instead, they moved closer, not physically, but in the way they existed within the same space, aware, aligned, and constantly measuring each other. Because now, the truth had changed everything. It had removed the illusion. It had exposed the structure beneath it, and it had forced both of them to acknowledge something undeniable. They were no longer enemies in the traditional sense, but they were not allies either. They were something in between, something undefined, something unstable, something that had the potential to become either destruction or connection, and neither of them was willing to walk away from it. Even after everything, even after the truth, even after the balance had shifted, Roman Vex did not let her go. Instead, he kept her closer, not out of control, but out of something far more dangerous, understanding that letting her leave would mean losing something he had only just begun to comprehend. And that was something he could not afford. Not now, not anymore, because for the first time in his life, losing control was no longer his greatest fear. Losing her was. By the time the shape of the truth between them had settled, nothing in Roman Vex's world looked broken. That was what made it dangerous. The structure of his empire still held. Orders were followed. Silence still obeyed him. Men still adjusted the moment he entered a room. Power still moved in his direction like something inevitable. To everyone watching from the outside, control remained exactly where it had always been. Inside Roman's hands, inside Roman's name, inside the cold precision of everything he had built. But power had changed. Not visibly. Not in ways that could be announced. Not in ways that could be measured by those who understood only force, only loyalty, only fear. It had changed because Arya Monroe no longer stood inside his world as someone contained by it. She stood within it untouched. That difference was subtle enough for most people to miss. But for Roman, it had become impossible not to see. She no longer carried herself like a woman who had once been cornered into a choice. There was no trace left of imposed fate in the way she moved, no sign of internal submission in the way she occupied a room. She did not seek permission. She did not seek space either. She simply existed with the kind of certainty that made space reorganize around her without her needing to ask for it. And that certainty did something Roman had not expected. It did not provoke him toward destruction. It made him pause. That pause, more than anything, marked the final transformation. Roman Vex had always believed power revealed itself in action, in enforcement, in control, in the ability to shape outcomes before anyone else understood they were being shaped. But Arya had introduced him to something more unsettling than direct resistance. She had shown him a form of power that did not need to announce itself to remain undeniable. It was the power of not bending, and she had mastered it. The realization settled into him slowly, but with irreversible weight. She was no longer a variable he was studying, no longer an anomaly that required mapping, no longer a threat whose shape he could still pretend remained undefined. She had moved beyond all of that. She had become something else entirely, something self-contained, self-governed, and impossible to possess without first misunderstanding what possession meant. That was where his control ended, not because she defeated him, not because she overthrew anything, not because the system failed, but because she had never belonged to the system in the first place. Roman saw in fragments at first, in the way others around her behaved, in the way even the most disciplined members of his inner structure had stopped reading her as temporary. They no longer watched her as an intrusion. They watched her as a fixed point, an influence whose presence now altered outcomes whether anyone acknowledged it or not. She had become part of the architecture, not by submission, by force of self. That should have unsettled him more than it did. A man like Roman should have seen it as contamination, an unknown presence inside a world built on exactness. He should have removed it, corrected it, reshaped it into something manageable. Instead, he found himself doing something far more dangerous. He accepted it, not easily, not all at once, but with the quiet recognition of a man who understood, perhaps for the first time, that total control had always been a flawed interpretation of power. There were things in this world that could be controlled. Systems, structures, men ruled by fear, outcomes ruled by pressure. And then there were things that remained outside of ownership altogether. Arya was one of them. That truth did not diminish him. It changed him. He stopped looking at her as if she were a problem waiting to reveal its final consequence. He stopped measuring her for weakness. He stopped searching her silences for hidden surrender. In their place came something else, something more disciplined, more restrained, and more dangerous precisely because of its restraint. Recognition. He recognized strength when he saw it. He recognized intelligence, strategy, endurance. But what existed in Arya went further than that. She had entered a world designed to reduce people into roles, and without spectacle, without rebellion, without pleading for distance from his reach, She had refused definition. She had not conquered his world. She had remained herself inside it. That became the one thing Roman could neither dominate nor dismiss. There was an emotional brutality in that realization that even he could not fully name. It did not feel like defeat. Roman Vex was not a man built to interpret transformation as surrender. It felt instead like exposure, his own, not hers, as if by refusing to break. Arya had forced something inside him into the light. Not weakness, not sentiment, limitation. For all his control, for all his discipline, for all the empires he had shaped through certainty, he had still believed power reached its highest form in possession. Arya had proven otherwise. She had become powerful the moment she ceased to be something anyone could claim. And once he understood that, obsession lost its old shape. It no longer looked like surveillance, no longer like heightened attention disguised as strategy, no longer like the quiet rearranging of his world. To keep her near, it evolved into something more difficult, because it required him to do what men like him rarely did honestly. It required acceptance. He accepted that her presence could not be reduced. He accepted that her decisions would not originate from his will. He accepted that whatever existed between them could not survive the old language of ownership. That did not make what existed between them softer. It made it sharper, because once control disappeared, what remained could no longer hide behind it. Their dynamic settled into something neither stable enough to be safe nor chaotic enough to collapse. It was balanced, but only in the way a blade is balanced. Precisely, beautifully, and with a constant promise of damage if handled carelessly. They had reached a point where neither needed to prove awareness to the other. Awareness was constant now, immediate, built into every silence they shared. Arya understood what Roman had become just as clearly as he understood what she now was. He was no longer trying to own her, but he still could not let her go. That contradiction defined him. It also defined them, because Arya, in her own way, had changed too, not in essence, not in the core of herself, which had remained intact long before Roman ever recognized it, but in position, in shape, in the place she occupied within the world around her. She was no longer surviving hidden beneath restraint. She was visible now, not in exposure, but in force. The quietness that once served as concealment had transformed into something else. Presence. People felt it before they could explain it. She did not need to assert authority for authority to register around her. She did not need to threaten for people to understand she was not to be handled carelessly. Her calm had become sharper than intimidation. Her composure had become harder to challenge than noise. She had become untouchable not because no one could reach her, but because reaching for her now carried consequence. Roman understood that better than anyone, and perhaps that was why he stopped standing above her in his mind. Not symbolically, not strategically. Actually, equal was not a word that came naturally to men like Roman Vex. Equality implied mutual limit, mutual respect, mutual recognition of force. It implied that power existed not in one direction, but in tension between two people capable of changing each other. And Arya had done exactly that. She had changed the way he understood power. The shift did not erase what he was. Roman remained dangerous, controlled, unforgiving where he chose to be. The empire around him did not soften because one woman refused to be defined by it, but he no longer equated dominance with strength as cleanly as he once had. He had seen too much now, seen the way pressure could fail, seen the way stillness could outlast coercion, seen the way a person who refused internal surrender could destabilize a system without ever openly fighting it. There was no going back from that. Power, he now understood, was not only the ability to control what stood before you. Sometimes it was the ability to stand before something uncontrollable and not destroy it simply because it would not kneel. That understanding did not make him better. It made him more dangerous, because now his restraint had purpose. Now his choices carried weight beyond instinct. Now what he protected with full awareness of what it cost him internally to do so. And Arya saw it, not in grand gestures. Roman Vex did not traffic in visible confession, but in small, precise shifts that would have gone unseen by anyone who did not understand him intimately through observation. The way his attention no longer tested her. The way his silences around her no longer carried interrogation. The way he began to leave space where once he would have closed it. The way his control no longer sought to surround her entirely. He adapted. That was the final truth. The man who once believed adaptation belonged to the weak had adapted to her existence, because her existence would not bend toward his. And in doing so, he revealed something he would never have spoken aloud. She had become a force too significant to meet with the old methods of control. There was a cruel beauty in that, because even as a new equilibrium formed, danger remained everywhere beneath it. Their understanding was real, but it was not peace. Their balance was powerful, but it was not safe. The world around them had not suddenly become more forgiving simply because they had stopped pretending their dynamic fit. Simpler terms. Outside forces still moved. Old loyalties still watched. The fractures connecting Arya to the wider shadows of Roman's past had not disappeared. If anything, their alignment made those fractures more volatile. Now she mattered more. Now he did too. And when two people of that kind of weight stop standing across from one another and begin standing in dangerous parallel, the world does not ignore for long. That was the unresolved truth beneath everything. They had not arrived at an ending. They had arrived at a condition, a stable danger, a controlled instability, a connection that could hold as long as neither of them betrayed the exact tension keeping it alive. But tension like that was never inactive. It breathed beneath every interaction. It sharpened every glance. It deepened every silence until silence itself felt like language. There were moments when the space between them carried more force than an open confrontation ever could, not because either had softened, but because both now knew exactly what the other was. Roman no longer saw Arya as someone he had once forced into his world. He saw her as the one presence within that world that had remained beyond his ability to govern. He could influence circumstances. He could shape structures. He could remove threats. He could decide the movement of entire networks with a single word, but he could not decide her. And that truth, rather than diminishing his fixation, purified it. What had once been obsession rooted in resistance became something colder, deeper, and far more permanent. It became a chosen awareness he no longer tried to deny. He would never control her. He had stopped wanting control, in the old sense anyway. What he wanted now was far more dangerous because it demanded permanence rather than victory. He wanted her present, intact, within reach, not possessed, but not absent, not broken, but not gone. And because Roman Vex was still Roman Vex, once he understood that desire clearly, it became part of the structure of his decisions whether he admitted it aloud or not. Arya understood that too. She also understood the risk in it, because a man who accepts what he cannot control does not necessarily become harmless. Sometimes he becomes more exact, more deliberate, more honest in the terrifying things he is willing to build around what matters to him. That was the unresolved edge between them now. Not dominance, not surrender, not even trust, only the dangerous stability of two people who had stopped underestimating each other. And somewhere beneath that stability lived the final transformation of them both. Arya had become powerful enough to belong only to herself, and Roman had become aware enough to know that loving power did not mean owning it. But awareness did not erase hunger. It only refined it. So when they stood across from each other now, nothing had to be spoken. The empire still moved. The silence still held. The world still believed Roman Vex remained untouchable and absolute. Perhaps in many ways he still was. But not here. Not with her. Because in the one place he had once expected obedience, he had found the only thing his power could not absorb. And somewhere in that quiet, sharpened space between acceptance and desire, a final truth waited, dangerous, unfinished, and moving slowly toward consequence. He thought forcing her to say yes proved his power. But in the end, he realized he lost control the moment she didn't break.